I'm not guilty. Does that include the time I stole a comic book when I was 5 years old?
You believe what you want to believe. I told you how I killed, why I killed. You don't want to believe it? That's up to you.
None of it was true. Because in court you gave such a graphic description of what had happened with Richard Mallory.
Yeah, after sitting around thinking how I could drum up a story.
May 31st, 1990, Eileen Wos killed 40-year-old Charles Edmund Karskeden after shooting him 9 times with a .22 caliber weapon. What was most unsettling was the fact that in her interview, she dramatically blamed the police for the murder she committed. Here are some of the most dramatic interviews with serial killers.
Okay, that's the way I'd like to start, and I'd like to kind of
Well, what do you got there? Let's see your list.
Well, I just like to go through the generalities, maybe talk about the background of the thing, the original case.
December 11th, 1978, John Wayne Gacy kidnapped and murdered Robert Piest. This would bring him into the eyes of the public, taking him to a point of no return. Born March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, John Wayne Gacy's early life was strained by a relationship with his abusive father and struggles with his identity. Despite these challenges, Gacy appeared to lead a relatively normal life for much of his early adulthood. He was a successful contractor, well-liked in his community, and even performed as a clown at local events, earning him the nickname, the Killer Clown. However, Gacy was living a dark and twisted double life. In 1968, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a boy, though he was released after serving just 18 months. Following that, Gacy would move to Norwood Park, Illinois, where he continued his contracting business and became active in local politics. Between 1972 and 78, Gacy's crimes escalated horrifically. He would lure young boys into his home with the promise of work and then would sexually assault, torture, and eventually kill them. Most of his victims were buried in his crawl space under the house. This predatory behavior continued for years, with at least 33 known victims. His downfall came in December 1978, when Robert Piest went missing after last being seen with Gacy. Investigators eventually searched his home, discovering the bodies of numerous victims. Gacy was arrested and convicted in 1980, and as a result of his heinous crimes, he was sentenced to death. In the 80s, he was interviewed by FBI profiler Robert Resler before his execution, which was marked with dramatic reactions. At the end of the interview, Gacy asks Resler if he thinks that the investigation in his case has been thoroughly investigated.
I think, John, in a case like this, and I find this in many major cases, that things are, at the time of the case, are done rather hastily because of the fact that there's pressure on it.
Normally, the interviewer is the one asking questions and not the interviewee, but this was something different. So in response to that question, Resler gave his answer, and Gacy didn't like it.
There's pressure on it.
Yeah, but that's a political answer. I know. Yeah. I don't want a political answer from you. I want a basic answer. Do you actually think that the investigation of my case has been done right?
In a dramatic move, Gacy cut him off from finishing his statement, and his face fell upon hearing Resler's response, utterly disappointed.
I believe in your case that there should have been more focus on others, as there should have been others checked out a little more thoroughly. That's the belief I've.
Pretty dramatic, if you ask us. After spending 14 years on death row, they took him out by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994.
I'm not guilty. Does that include the time I stole a comic book when I was 5 years old? I am not guilty of the charges which have been filed against me.
Welcome to February 1st, 1974. Ted Bundy rapes and kills 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy before dumping her body. This would just be one of the sexually motivated murders he committed. Born back on November 24th, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Ted Bundy had a troubled childhood, being raised by his grandparents believing that his mother was his sister. But despite these early challenges, Bundy appeared charming, intelligent, even highly charismatic, which eventually helped him hide his dark side for years. Bundy's life took that dark turn during his time as a law student. He would trick girls, pretending to be injured or in need of help to gain their trust. and once they were isolated, he would kidnap, assault, and murder them. His crimes began in the early 70s, mostly targeting college women in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His good looks and personable demeanor helped him avoid suspicion for a long time. By 1975, Bundy was arrested in Utah for the attempted kidnapping of a woman, which did lead to suspicions about his involvement in other crimes. He ended up escaping custody twice during his trial process. In 1978, his reign of terror would finally come to an end after a violent spree at a Florida sorority house, where he killed 2 women and severely injured others. Bundy was eventually convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. He spent nearly a decade on death row, during which he gave a lot of interviews, revealing details about his horrific acts. In a somewhat dramatic interview when asked by his interviewer, Stephen McCod, about what pushed him over the edge, his facial expression was lustful when stating that it's difficult to describe a sensation that just reaches a point where something snapped in him. You see, according to him, he couldn't control it anymore. In a follow-up question about the girl he killed, the look he gave the interviewer was pure evil, almost like saying he didn't want to be questioned about her. Then in a statement he made that leaves chills, he said in a very remorseless tone that there's no way in the world killing him would restore or bring back the lives of those beautiful children he'd killed.
I don't know all of what you're speaking about, Lucky. It's too broad and I can't get into it in any detail. But I'm satisfied with my blanket statement that I'm innocent. Ever physically harmed anyone? No.
His responses felt unexpected and thought-provoking, with this casual, almost indifferent look on his face and those sarcastic grins. Every now and then he would just take a long pause, enough to shoot a quick glance at the camera, adding an extra layer to the tension in the room. Now, this guy admitted to killing at least 30 women. Many believe the true number, though, is much higher. On January 24th, 1989, Bundy was fried in Florida's electric chair.
I was a hellraiser. We're always in fights. I didn't have no playmates other than my sister and brother and cousins. Stayed there all day until dark. Then, split her open. From her neck to her groin.
The Genesee River Killer, Mr. Arthur Shacross, had been under the radar until the body of June Cicero was found. However, in November 1989, things took a turn, 2 years after his initial release. Born on June 6, 1945 in Kittery, Maine, it's been said that this man went through severe abuse and bullying as a child. But after he grew up, he served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. And though he claimed to have committed horrific acts during his service, many of these were found to be exaggerated or false. After returning to civilian life, though, Shacross's violent tendencies began to surface. In 1972, he was convicted of killing 2 children in Watertown, New York, Jack Blake and Karen Hill. He was given 25 years in prison, but was controversially paroled after just serving 15 years. The decision to release him would later be heavily criticized. So after his release in 1987, Shacross moved to Rochester, New York, where he began a killing spree that would make him infamous. Between 1988 and 90, he murdered at least 11 women, most of whom were prostitutes. Shacross would often dump their bodies near the Genesee River, earning him that nickname. His brutal methods and ability to blend into his surroundings just shocked the community and baffled investigators. They caught his ass in January 1990, after police observed him near the scene where one of his victims had been discovered. He did confess to the murders and was given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, before his death, he was granted an interview while incarcerated at Correctional Sullivan Facility in Fallsburg, New York. And it would be Shacross's behavior making this interview entirely dramatic. Watch what happens when they ask him about the murders of 2 children in Waterloo.
But I'm just wondering why you're prepared to talk about it and not Watertown.
I don't want to talk about it. You say one more question, I leave.
Throughout the interview, Shacross had this intense way of reacting with his eyes, as if he was trying to communicate something beyond words. It felt like he was on this verge of losing control emotionally, or maybe even about to do something unexpected, which made him cut things short and hastily want to leave.
Just a final question, Arthur. I mean, why won't you talk about the two young children?
As the interviewer kept on pressing for an answer, Shacross showed a calm demeanor as he removed the microphone from his shirt, put it on the table, and left the room without a word. That silent exit left a lingering tension, making it clear that he wasn't willing to continue the conversation any further.
It's over.
Is it because you're ashamed of it?
It's disconnect. This is over.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Shacross spent the rest of his life behind bars, dying of a heart attack on November 10, 2008, at the age of 63.
Save it. It's not hard to kill somebody. You can kill somebody pretty easy if you have the mindset for it.
March 15, 1994, Gary Ray Bowles beat and strangled John Hardy Roberts, killing him instantly. However, this would be one of 6 murders he committed that same year. Born January 25, 1962, in Clifton Forge, Virginia, this man was known as the I95 Killer, and he would grow up in Rupert, West Virginia. His father, a coal miner, passed away from black lung disease 6 months before Bowles was born. His mother, Frances, remarried several times, and Bowles endured a rough childhood. His second stepfather, a violent alcoholic, regularly abused him. By 13 years old, Bowles fought back against his stepdad, severely injuring him, and he would eventually run away when his mother chose to stay in that marriage. This led him to living on the streets for years, during which he turned to sex work, serving male clients to survive. In 1982, Bowles was arrested for beating and sexually assaulting his girlfriend, which earned him a 6-year prison sentence. When he got out in 1991, he was soon convicted again of unarmed robbery for snatching an elderly lady's purse, resulting in another 4-year sentence, though he only served 2. After his release again in 1993, Bowles committed his first known murder on March 15, 1994. His victim, 59-year-old John Hardy Roberts, had offered him a place to stay in Daytona Beach, Florida. Bowles killed Robert and then used his credit card in various locations. Over the next 6 months, Bowles murdered 5 more men: David Jarman, Milton Bradley, Alverson Carter Jr., Albert Morris, and Walter Jamel J. Hinton. He would prostitute himself to his victims before beating and strangling them, and then stealing their credit cards. On November 12, 1994, Bowles was again arrested and convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Initially sentenced to death in 1997, the Florida Supreme Court overturned that sentence, but he was again resentenced to death in 1999. Now, before his execution, he was granted an interview on the show The Killer Speaks, and from his actions and words, one could tell that his interview was nothing short of a dramatic experience. During the interview, Bowles stated in a boastful tone that he felt all right after killing and leaving the body of one of his victims behind, saying that killing a human is like killing a fly. Pretty easy.
How did you feel afterwards leaving the body behind?
I don't know. I felt all right, you know. There's not really a way to describe it, you know. It just, I guess, relief.
He did admit to stealing one of his victims' identity to evade capture, and then unexpectedly just burst into laughter, seemingly impressed by his own cunning and genius for coming up with the idea. Right after his last murder at Daytona Beach, Florida, Nassau County, Bowles just disappeared without a trace. He talked about how he searched the room like he always did, and stumbled on this wallet in the closet that belonged to some guy named Timothy Whitfield, who was an acquaintance of his victim.
So I took the birth certificate and social security card. I took it down to the DMV and I told him I lost my driver's license, and I basically became Timothy Ronald Whitfield.
At 57 years old, he was eventually executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison.
You definitely have an English accent.
I definitely have an English accent, yeah. Bill, do you count the number of days, months, and years that you've been here?
About 29 years.
Killing a civilian is one thing, but killing a police officer is a whole nother. And this was the case with Billy Wayne Coble, as he committed the 3 gruesome murders that brought his very own demise. Born September 12, 1948, in Texas, Billy Coble was the youngest of 3 siblings, but unlike his older siblings, Billy was raised by a single mother after his father passed away 3 months before his birth. His mother, who only had a 4th grade education, struggled with her own mental health issues, becoming even more unstable after her husband's death. Despite her condition, she started a new relationship with this alcoholic, but there's no record of him being abusive. At just 5 years old, Billy lost his aunt, which sent his mother into a deep depression and led to a mental breakdown. By 1959, Billy and his siblings were placed in an orphanage after their mother was hospitalized. Even after her release, they were still in that orphanage, and Billy's time there was pretty bad. He had a history of poor accountability and would often blame others. He had poor impulse control and also low self-esteem. He would even assault a girl because he didn't like how she spoke to him. But despite these issues, he graduated high school. So at 17, Billy enlisted in the Army while still living at that orphanage. He served in the Vietnam War as a rifleman and machine gunner before returning home and joining the Army Reserve in 1970. By age 22, he married his first wife, but after 5 years of abusive and controlling behavior, she divorced him. His second marriage also ended in divorce in 1987 due to the same abusive patterns. In July 1988, Billy married Karen Vicha and moved in with her in Texas near her family. When their marriage also became abusive, Karen sought for that divorce. But in 1989, after being released on bail for kidnapping and assaulting her, Billy killed Karen's parents and a brother who was in the police force, and also attempted to kill her. 8 days before his scheduled execution, he was granted a final interview in prison, and of course, this was a dramatic one. A few seconds before the actual interview began, the interviewer greets him and introduces herself, to which he says nothing. He had a really sarcastic way of answering the question and putting the interviewer on the spot.
When you reflect now on the reason that you've spent almost 30 years here on death row, it was for an act of extreme violence. Do you regret what you did that day? Do you understand and feel the horror of what happened?
Was you there? Why do you speak it, Gacy? It's the truth.
What happened? What happened?
You say, I did. Mm-hmm. How can you say something if you wasn't there?
On February 28, 2019, at 70 years of age, he was eventually executed by lethal injection in the Huntsville unit, Huntsville, Texas.
The first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush, and it was just like that shot of dope. Every time I did it, it was that rush again, and I started chasing that high.
July 5th, 1979. Tommy Lynn Sells allegedly kills John Cade with a .32 caliber pistol during a home invasion. This was one of 22 murders he was linked to. However, he was only convicted of one, a conviction that led to his eventual demise. Born on June 28, 1964 in Oakland, California, Tommy Lynn Sells, also known as the Coast to Coast Killer, was one of 5 children to his unmarried mother. Joe Lovins, his believed biological father, died when Sells was 11 years old. Sells eventually went to live with his aunt, Bonnie Walpole, in Holcomb, Missouri. He was brought back to his mother at the age of 5, when she found out that Walpole wanted to adopt her son. At age 7, he began consuming alcohol from his maternal grandfather's supply stockpile on a regular basis. Within a year, he was socializing with this adult named Willis Clark, who began molesting him. Shockingly, his mom encouraged that relationship, which traumatized him even more. Sells would begin using narcotics when he was just 10 years old, and 3 years later, he'd be banned from the house because he entered his grandmother's bed nude while she was sleeping. Pretty crazy. Well, at age 14, Sells began living as a nomad permanently. That's because his mom threw him out of the house when he tried to molest her in the shower after visiting his family in Little Rock, Arkansas. Thereafter, he failed to receive any any mental health care, and then his drinking got worse. In 1982, leading to his first arrest for public intoxication. Sells spent much of his homeless life hitchhiking and hopping trains across the U.S., committing various crimes as he went along. During this time, he would work manual labor and even as a barber, while spending most of his days drinking heavily, abusing drugs, and cycling in and out of prison. In the late 90s, while serving time, Sells got married to Nora Price. After his release in 1997, the couple would move to Tennessee, but the relationship wouldn't last long because Sells would leave her and return to his wandering, troubled life on the road that same year. From July 5, 1979 to December 31, 1999, Sells committed 22 murders while drifting from coast to coast across the U.S., which were confirmed by authorities. He claimed that he had killed 70 people, and some of his victims were sexually assaulted before he killed them. He would kill his victims in various ways, often beating them to death, slitting their throats, or even stabbing and shooting them. After being caught by police, he was only convicted of one murder, for which he was sentenced to death in 2000. Before his execution, though, he'd been granted an interview, and the interview was practically as erratic as it was dramatic. When they asked Sells to describe the murder of one of his victims, he pauses for a long moment, making it seem like he was about to give an answer, but instead he made the interviewer quickly apologize.
I wonder if you could just tell me what happened as you were killing her. Did she give birth to a baby?
You know, you're pushing your luck.
I'm sorry.
Let's not get into blood and guts, because that's what you're trying to get into.
Even described something that felt like a threat to the interviewer, sounding very sarcastic while giving his detailed explanation. At 49 years old, they killed him with that lethal injection on April 3, 2014 in Huntsville, Texas.
Richard Ramirez, he is originally from El Paso, Texas, and he's accused of being one of California's most brutal killers.
April 10, 1984. The murder of Mei Lung was committed in the basement of her apartment building in San Francisco's Tenderloin district, with no information or anyone connected to the crime, until the DNA of Richard Ramirez matched the evidence found at the scene, and the case would finally point to someone, bringing this person one step closer to facing justice. Born February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez was the youngest of 5 children of Mercedes Munoz and Julian Ramirez. His father, who worked on the railways, struggled with alcohol and often lashed out violently at his family. By the time Ramirez was 10, he'd already started experimenting with marijuana and alcohol. By the time he was 12, his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War vet, took him under his wing. Miguel had a dark past, having committed several violent acts during that war, which he later shared with young Ramirez. At 14, Richard started using LSD and growing more interested in Satanism and the occult, heavily influenced by his cousin's twisted mindset. So as he grew older, his violent sexual fantasies started to take hold of him. These fantasies would eventually blend with his later criminal activities, and at 22, he moved to California, where he developed a cocaine addiction and started supporting that addiction through burglaries. Over time, these break-ins escalated to violent crimes, including rape and murder. It was between April 1984 and August 1985 that Ramirez terrorized the greater LA and San Francisco Bay areas, killing at least 14 people. He would attack people during nighttime, using a variety of weapons like handguns, knives, machetes, and even a hammer. This guy not only killed, but also tortured and humiliated many of his victims, sometimes sparing their lives only to degrade them. This guy was convicted on 12 counts of murder in 1989 and sentenced to death. While on death row, he married Doreen Loy, a fan who had written to him during his time in San Quentin. Now, before his death, he had granted at least 2 interviews. During one of these interviews, airing in 1993, he carried himself like someone who had achieved a lot, clearly proud of what he had done. When asked questions, he responded with a slow smile, glancing confidently to the side. His entire demeanor reflected satisfaction, as if he were being honored for great accomplishments.
Why on earth would you have hurt those people? Why did you kill those people?
No comment.
At the same time, he had a nonchalant and unremorseful vibe.
I cannot answer it at this time.
In this other session, the interviewer asked him, "Who are you?" To which Ramirez paused for an eerily long time, as if he didn't have an answer, to only dramatically let out this sigh before giving the most vague response.
Who are you?
Just a guy. Just a guy.
Ramirez even tried to sound intelligent during the conversation, only to be uncovered by the interviewer.
People in this day and age are brainwashed and programmed like a computer at being nothing more than puppets. This nation, this country is founded in violence. Violent delights tend to have violent ends. Madness is something rare in individuals, but in groups, people, and ages, it is a rule. Killing is killing, whether done for duty, profit, or fun. Men murdered themselves into this democracy.
You're good at reading your script, Richard, but you're not much at answering my direct questions.
On June 7th, 2013, while awaiting execution, Ramirez died of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California.
You know, I was just wondering how you're going to be, at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Are you prepared?
I'm prepared. I'm all right. I'm all right with it.
May 31st, 1990, Eileen Wos kills 40-year-old Charles Edmund Karskeden after shooting him 9 times with a .22 caliber weapon. Now, this is a person who would blame the police for the murder she committed. Born February 29th, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, Eileen had a chaotic childhood. Her father, a convicted child molester, was absent for most of her life, while her mother just abandoned her at a young age. Eileen and her brother were raised by their grandparents, but that environment was far from nurturing. She would get abused, neglected, and sexually assaulted during her early years, which greatly shaped her later behavior. As a teenager, she would turn to sex work to survive, drifting across the country and finding herself in constant legal trouble. Her criminal record included robbery, forgery, and other minor offenses, but it was her killing spree from 1989 to 90 that brought her infamy. Eileen was convicted of killing 7 men, all of whom she claimed had either assaulted or attempted to assault her while she was working as a prostitute. Her defense argued that these killings were acts of self-defense, but the jury didn't buy it. Eileen was given the death penalty for the 6 murders and remained unapologetic throughout her trial and prison stay. Her erratic behavior in court, often filled with outbursts, only intensified the media's fascination with her. Now, before her death, Eileen really wanted to tell the public the truth. However, her actions in these interviews were nothing short of dramatic.
And he said I did the most horrendous crime in the whole wide world.
Not true?
I guess not.
In an attempt to further explain her point, she goes on and on, describing more gruesome and extreme acts of violence, a clear comparison of what she should have done.
All they were was shot and left. If it was a horrendous crime, why didn't I shoot them between the eyes, cut their penis off, stick it in their mouth, do all kinds of gross stuff? All they were was shot and left,
At one point, she interrupts the interviewer and laughs as if she's trying to emphasize something.
Maybe you were just born bad.
I don't know about you. I'm telling you, man. No, I wasn't born bad.
In her final interview with Nick Broomfield, she screamed at him, all in this attempt to try to answer Nick, and in turn insults him with her sharp tone.
Nonetheless, you killed 7 men.
Yes, you
And I'm
did.
asking you, what got you to kill the 7
And I'm
men?
telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't
But
you
not,
get it?
Not everybody is killing 7 people.
Then she goes to rant about how society sabotaged her life and cursed everyone.
Couldn't even get a fair trial. Couldn't even get a fair investigation or nothing. Couldn't even have my appeals right. You sabotaged my society and the cops and the system. A raped woman got executed. It was used for books and movies and shit. Ladder climbs, the election, everything else. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot. You're an inhumane bunch of fucking living bastards and bitches, and you're gonna get your asses nuked in the end, and pretty soon it's coming.
In 2002, after spending over a decade on death row, Eileen Wos was taken out by lethal injection. Her story, no doubt filled with hardship and tragedy, has been the subject of many books, documentaries, and movies. Most notably, the 2003 film Monster, starring Charlize Theron.
Clark was serving 6 death sentences for a killing spree. In the summer of 1980, he and his accomplice, Carol Bundy, preyed on vulnerable young women in Hollywood, often runaways and prostitutes.
Let's go to June 24th, 1980. Douglas Clark lures 2 young female sex workers, Exie Wilson and Karen Jones, into his car, only to be murdered by him. He would discard their bodies in plain sight right after taking the head of Wilson. This was one of the numerous murders he committed. However, the most unsettling thing wouldn't be just the murders, but the reason behind it. Necrophilia. Born on March 10, 1948, Douglas Clark, infamously known as the Sunset Strip Killer, was one of 5 children, raised in a well-off military family. His father was a retired naval admiral, working in naval intelligence. Despite a privileged upbringing, though, Clark began exhibiting disturbing behavior as a teenager. He secretly recorded his sexual encounters with girls at school and harbored increasingly dark fantasies about rape, murder, and necrophilia. After graduating high school in 1976, Clark joined the U.S. Air Force, where he was stationed in both Colorado and Ohio. After his discharge, he spent the next decade drifting through various jobs, often working as a mechanic. He eventually went to Los Angeles, where he briefly worked as a steam plant operator for the LA Department of Water and Power. However, he left that job abruptly and later took position as a boiler operator at a soap factory in Burbank, only to be fired due to frequent absences and violent threats toward co-workers. You see, Clark spent much of his free time drinking from bar to bar and preying on older women, exploiting them financially. And by late 1979, he would meet Carol Bundy, a nurse who had recently left her abusive husband. Well, the two quickly developed a sadistic relationship, moving in together the same day they met. Clark would often bring over sex workers to their apartment for threesomes. By 1980, Clark and Bundy would go on a killing spree, murdering at least 7 individuals, though authorities say there might be more. Clark often decapitated his victims and kept their heads as gruesome trophies. His targets were usually young women, which included prostitutes and runaways. In August 1980, Clark was arrested and convicted of 6 murders. He was sentenced to death, and that sentence was upheld upon review in 1992. In this interview recorded at California's San Quentin prison, Clark acted in a way that can only be described as dramatic. Upon getting into the interview room, he launches into a series of complaints directed against his accomplice, Bundy, without being asked any questions.
Director's rules, SHU unit, that means segregated housing unit. Level 4, that's what I'm housed under, that's what Carol Bundy's housed under. She gets 12 interviews in a quarter without blinking an eye. She gets 6 hours, she gets out counted, she gets to walk around out the main line. Anything to make her look good. She's the government rat lion bitch.
He whines about a lot of things, trying to show off hints of anger and jealousy directed towards Bundy.
She's getting all the visits she wants, as long as she wants, too. 6 hours, 8 hours, no problem. Walking around, no shackles, civilian clothing. Yet when the same rules apply to me, all of a sudden...
At one point, he would rant for about 3 minutes about how the death penalty is a political issue and death row inmates couldn't be afforded to look human because their rights and privileges were restrained and removed. Yeah, anyways, on October 11th, 2023, he died at 75 years old of unspecified natural causes at a medical facility.
Racist serial killer Joseph Paul Franklin has been executed. Franklin bombed a synagogue in Chattanooga in the late 1970s. Thankfully, no one was hurt.
It's August 7th, 1977, and Franklin shoots and kills a couple, Alphonse Manning Jr. and Tony Schwen, in a parking lot at Easttown Mall in Madison, Wisconsin. The motive behind this disturbing act would be one thing: racism. Born April 13, 1950, as James Clayton Vaughn Jr. in Mobile, Alabama, Joseph Paul Franklin had a deeply troubled upbringing. His father, James Clayton Vaughn Sr., a World War II veteran, was an alcoholic who often disappeared for long stretches, only to return and abuse Joseph and his siblings. When Joe was 8, his father abandoned the family for good. His mother was described as a strict, emotionally distant perfectionist with German roots, who would offer little comfort or stability. As a result, Joe grew up in this environment filled with physical abuse and neglect, often going hungry at times. So in high school, Joe's interest took a dark turn as he became fascinated with evangelical Christianity, which soon led to an obsession with Nazism. He would later become involved with supremacist groups like the National Socialist White People's Party and the Ku Klux Klan. At 19, Joseph married Bobby Lee Dorman, but the marriage fell apart after just 4 months. At age 26, Joe legally changed his name to Joseph Paul Franklin in honor of Nazi propaganda chief Paul Joseph Goebbels and American founding father Benjamin Franklin. Influenced by Adolf Hitler's book entitled Mein Kampf, Franklin became fixated on starting a race war, more specifically targeting Black and Jewish people. He drifted up and down the East Coast, supporting himself by robbing banks and donating blood for money, while plotting to rid the world of those he deemed inferior. So in July 1977, Franklin firebombed a synagogue in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Though fortunately, no one was killed, as most of the worshippers had already left. Between 1977 and 80, Franklin went on this brutal killing spree, murdering at least 22 people, primarily Black and Jewish individuals. His hate-driven crimes resulted in his arrest by October 28, 1980. Convicted of 8 murders, he received multiple life sentences and 2 death sentences, spending 15 years on death row in Missouri. In this jailhouse interview with CNN, he was asked about the number of people he murdered.
Do you know how many people you murdered?
Yeah, but I'd rather not mention it.
For other questions, his responses made the murders look irrelevant in the face of his own problems.
Do you think about those 2 boys in Cincinnati?
No, I don't really think about them. I mean, I can't go back and think about the cases, individually.
As the interview goes on, they ask him if he regards himself as a hero to these hatred groups that support his beliefs.
Do you think you're a hero to those hate groups?
Well, that's what they tell me,
On November 20th, 2013, at the age of 63, he was taken out by lethal injection at Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center.